all, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me talk to you here today and to tell you about my most recent and still ongoing research. The Paralympics just ended over a month ago, so I'm still conducting post-event interviews. I certainly would have loved to be in Princeton in person. I've never been, unfortunately. And thank you, Professor Ramo, for inviting me, at least here now virtually. And I am quite sorry. I hope you invite me again, and I'll be delighted to talk about my other research. But this is actually now, as you mentioned, really far off from my other foci of research. But let me just briefly set the stage, and then hopefully that becomes clear why I engaged in this research. So let's go back to 2018, because it was in April 2018 when I left the University of Vienna and went back to Tokyo and took up my current post, as Jim said, as Deputy Director at the German Institute for Japanese Studies. I had lived there until 2013 already, but now when I came back, I was really surprised to see that already, even though it was still 2 years to go, there was already such a buzz and anticipation of the Tokyo Olympics. So what you see here are just a few pictures I took throughout the city. So you could see flags throughout the city, Olympic flags in front of schools, in local districts in Tokyo. You could see more and more popping up these new types of Toyota taxis that are now, of course, totally common in the cityscape, but in 2018 were still very new. Down below, you see the picture that was also on the poster for this event, and that's the long way from Shinjuku Station, Japan's busiest train station, all the way to Nishi, to the western part of Shinjuku. I walk that every single day, at least pre-pandemic. You saw the buzz up there on how to get tickets for the big event. And the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building at night, oftentimes lit up in the Olympic colors. Buildings were decorated already. And all of a sudden, pop-up stores came here and there of Tokyo 2020 official shops. This one is in this largest electronics store in Big Kamada. You have those stores popping up in big shopping malls and so on. And throughout the city, you found these countdown clocks, countdown timers that were counting down the days to the begin of the Olympics as well as the Paralympics. And that, I thought, also was something unique, because the Olympics as well as the Paralympics were very much marketed on an even scale. All right, and then you also had the 1 year to go campaign, and a big buzz, and tons of people, and of course the big sponsors being out there and around. And so eventually that made me think, we as the DIJ, as a very interdisciplinary institute located in Tokyo, so on site, would be ideal institute, or ideal accumulation of researchers to do something on this topic. And so then, together with colleagues, sorry, my cat is playing ball underneath me. So I edited this book, Japan Through the Lens of the Tokyo Olympics. So we explain the multifaceted impact of the Tokyo Olympics on Tokyo, on Japan, and on its society, on its businesses, and I believe even its self-identity. And that's actually happened way before the games ever started And actually, I believe that's irrespective of the postponement and irrespective of the changes and modifications due to the pandemic. So the book assembles 34 chapters covering all relevant aspects of society, economy, culture, and politics. So we have chapters on technology, food, security, work, media, sexuality, history, film, linguistics, volunteering, architecture, advertising, and of course, also some sports. The target audience is both an interested public. There were supposed to be 40 million people arriving in Japan from abroad in 2020. But also it's a book that I envision as would make a great entry-level textbook to studying Japan, as it also looks very it's multidisciplinary, and it's a very easy read, very short chapters, and so it's a free. We're a government-funded institute, so we made it an open access book. It's free on the Kindle app and with the publisher. So feel free to check that out. All right. So now coming to the vision of really Japan wanted to reinvent itself through the Tokyo Olympics. These were supposed to be, and I'm sure you heard plenty about it, supposed to be the recovery Olympics, so that Japan showed that it overcame the triple disaster of March 2011. Japan wanted to show its efforts in terms of diversity and inclusion, its efforts in sustainability. You see here the Olympic medals that were made out of scrap material. So that's one of the elements of sustainability. It was supposed to give the country a pretty big economic boost. The country was supposed to come together, the people, and really create again a feeling of unity that the country, it would have been preferable if that would have worked, and also create a new volunteer culture. So, and the term legacy is here important. So it was supposed to create a soft legacy that is supposed to continue on for decades. And that once the volunteers experience this amazing and exciting experience of volunteering for the Olympics, that they were supposed to then be so inspired that they would be willing to volunteer in other areas in the future, and by that improve Japanese society, help the country in its significant aging and the decline in workforce. So those were the visions. But then, as you know, the pandemic hit, and just at the end of March 2020, the official announcement came that the Olympics would be postponed by 1 year. And so we kind of took a detour to that massive event. The city remained flagged, and for a while that looked rather sad, actually, throughout the city. So the three questions I had, I wrote already a short chapter in our book that came out in spring 2020, but throughout, what was driving my interest was I wanted to understand more the hopes and dreams of being an Olympic volunteer. So really understand the motivations behind it. On the other hand, then, of course, as the pandemic hit, I wanted to understand what was the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on the experience of volunteering. So that goes into my research interest on life satisfaction, happiness, and well-being. And then because there was such a big issue made by the organizers and the government about creating a volunteer legacy, it's still way too early to know, but getting little dabs on what really remains. Will there be more people volunteering, and will this bring about the envisioned social change that it was hoped for. Now, the way I structure my talk here is that I'll just briefly go into a definition and typology of volunteering, that I talk about the vision and the motivations. I give you insight into the journey itself, because as Jim mentioned, I signed up and registered as volunteer and was accepted. Then I talk about my very fresh field work at the Games. I was a volunteer at the Paralympic Games, and then we'll go back to the 3 research questions and ask, and I try to see if I can talk about something already about the volunteer legacy. All right, there's tons of definitions here. I just put one in, definition on volunteer. So the volunteer is someone who chooses to act in recognition of a need with an attitude of social responsibility and without concern for monetary profit and gain. Right? Let's look at volunteering in comparison. And this is OECD data. And you see here in the middle is the average of the OECD, and Japan has significantly less people volunteering in formal organizations, whereas you have, like, the US is here very much on the top, and Germany is also has higher rates of volunteering than Japan. But when you look at types of activities, and you see here again the average, OECD average, Germany is actually all of a sudden the outlier, with Germany having, and sorry, I'm using Germany as comparison because that's my country, but Germany as a country where there's very little volunteering in social and health services, lower one, the dark blue, but more so in education and culture, a little bit on social movements. But the gray area here is a high incidence of volunteering in sports related aspects. In Japan, you see Japan and the US are right next to each other. And so social and health services are much more than the average OECD country. So they engage much more in social and health service volunteering and less so in sports volunteering. Now, there's another kind of volunteering that this chart by the OECD doesn't talk about, which is sports mega event volunteering. It's a different kind of volunteering. And so maybe the vision that you have in your mind when you think about that, other than Tokyo 2020, would be the London 2012 Olympics or Rio 2016. So huge crowds of smiling, happy, cheerful crowds of volunteers. And you have to also distinguish in sports mega event volunteering what kind of volunteer, what kind of mega event you're talking about. And of course, researchers talk about tier 1 or tier 2 mega events, but then of course the Olympics are right there at the top, as that is the world's largest sports mega event. So usually, so you would have to really distinguish between, are you talking about more the social volunteering, where that definition would fit better, or this mega sports event volunteering that goes into more. So mega sports event volunteering is very much episodic volunteering. So it's oftentimes it's a once in a lifetime experience. These events don't come around all the time, versus your engagement as a volunteer in social and health services or education or so on would be oftentimes more of a continuous or repeating type of volunteering. We know for Japan, and many researchers have looked into that in terms of disaster volunteering, very important, and the Kobe 1995, the Great Hanshin earthquake, is certainly a turning point in Japanese volunteering. And so that's really important as well. Particularly for Japan, researchers have also looked at, is volunteering really voluntary, or is it not really voluntary volunteering, right? So a lot of the volunteering you do in neighborhood associations in Shonaikai, often described as, well, that's not really voluntary. And we see that other researchers had looked at happiness in terms of volunteering, and these not really voluntary volunteering did not really up people's level of well-being. And here I'd like to give you a quote by one of my fellow field cast members when I interviewed her a couple of weeks ago. And she mentioned, well, you know, in Japan, there's this difference between fun volunteering and sad volunteering. And for her, the fun volunteering was the mega event, the Olympic volunteering. And she termed anything social issues volunteering as sad volunteering. So these are not my terms, but this came from her, and I thought I'd give you that quote here. Now, even way before the Olympics started, there was very binary discourse on volunteering for the Olympics. On the one hand, you had the publication by Nishikawa Chiharu, and he gave talks I attended, which were attended by a lot of mostly women who were very eager to be volunteers and wanted to hear about his experience and his application and his entire journey. And he had volunteered before at the London Olympics. He had volunteered at Rio. He brought his uniform with him that people after the talk really excitedly looked at. And he was telling them what an amazing experience volunteering is, that it's really a life-changing opportunity, that you really have the opportunity to make friends, that it would help you to get a job later, and that you really get a look behind the stage of the Olympics. And he actually worked for the Tokyo government, or better, the Tokyo Olympic Committee, in his role as translator, in his role for fieldcast interviews, and so on. So, but on the other hand, there's discourse that considers volunteering for the Olympics as Black volunteering. That's the title of the book by Honma Liu. And it's a scathing critique of the Olympic volunteer conditions. And the critique is equally voiced by the entire anti-Olympic movement. But the main arguments here are that volunteers were told that they get 1,000 yen daily for volunteering, and that would be highly insufficient for the work that they're doing. They critique the recruitment techniques and said, well, that is not really voluntary. And there we go into this voluntary, not really voluntary, because university students, schools seem to have been pressured to recruit people into the program. The work hours, this is, if you want to sign up to be a volunteer for the Olympics, you have to commit to a minimum of 10 days of full-time working, and that without pay would they consider exploitation. And the working conditions, we know in Japan, summer is extraordinarily hot, extraordinarily humid, and that makes for very dangerous working conditions. And so these are the main areas of critique. Now let's come to the journey that started in 2018. So shortly after I arrived, from September to December 2018, you could put in your online application to become a volunteer. And so you really, if you lived throughout that time in Tokyo, you really couldn't miss it. There were even people standing at train stations. There were advertisements on television. I mean, it was in the newspaper. It was all around you. And I think we have a little bit of time, so I want to, it's just a minute and a half, but this is the promotional video. I mean, you can watch it on YouTube. It's still uploaded, but I thought it really shows you what they were hoping to, and I believe it's actually pretty well done. So let's watch that briefly. I hope the volume is loud enough. But there's subtitles. All right, so I'll be happy. Let's talk more about that maybe later, but you saw the goal of diversity that was supposed to be recruited, people with disabilities, all different kind of age groups, the concept of omotenashi, so Japanese style of hospitality, the different kind of motivations for the Olympics. So that was, these are just some of the points here already mentioned. All right, so eventually the names were set for those that worked at the venues. They're called field cast, and those that work within the city guiding these spectators to sightseeing spots or standing at train stations, standing at the airport, then are called city cast. Japan wanted a number of 110,000 volunteers, so 80,000 field cast, 30,000 city cast. This is higher than it has ever been. None of the other previous Olympics had that high of a number. And you could choose when you applied for 10 different fields. So media, driving, healthcare, technology, or organizational support, and so on. So whereas in the beginning, the organizers were rather scared that there would not be enough applicants, eventually Japan ended up with, or TOC ended up with 204,680 applicants. Of these, 36% are male, 64% are female. 36 have a foreign nationality, even though we don't know how many people from abroad actually. I mean, there's several, and I worked one of them, and I worked with several of those that are foreign nationals but live in Japan. So that's not quite clear. And then 64% of Japanese nationals. The ages range from 18 to 80s, so they really achieved that diversity. What we don't really know, and that has not been announced, is the actual number of volunteers that eventually in 2021 actually volunteered and worked. We know, and I'll say more later, that a lot then changed and took paying volunteer jobs instead of doing it for free. But we'll get to that later. So then February to May, we had an orientation meeting that was really quite elaborate, very professionally organized, and that was still part of the selection process. You had to say why you're motivated to working at the Olympics. We had to do, in order to spark communication, we had to do projects together and communicate with each other. So eventually it took then until September 2019 until we actually got the notification. So it was a long wait. But then shortly thereafter, starting in October 2019, the general training session started. These were 3-hour events in the Yogi Sports Center, and they continued on until the pandemic struck, so until February of 2020. And you got your field cast handbook, you got stickers, and really diversity and inclusion was also an important part in this 3-hour teaching. And it was the first time we got to see the uniforms. They were shown to us right there at the training site. And then even though the pandemic started and we knew it's still another year to wait, but they continued rolling out the notification on our roles and what Olympic venues we would be working at. There were some changes then eventually, but e-learning was anyway shown to be, considered or planned, but it became even more so important because there was nothing that in person could be done anymore. So I'll just give you, and we were supposed to keep watching and watching and watching it over and over again to really understand, so we would become confident volunteers. So just a few of these quotes. The material is really rich and would need more analysis than I can give you here right now, but and that's where the smile comes in. Over and over, we are told Tokyo 2020 is an event full of smiles. Volunteers are vital. Their hard work builds the excitement of the event, and Fieldcast and CityCast are also stars of the game. So it elevated, the organizers elevated our status so that, it makes you even more special to be part of this mega event. But now there was then a lot of talk and also a lot of concern among volunteers. So volunteering during the pandemic, how is that supposed to look like? For the longest time, we were only told, well, you're going to have to be wearing a mask, and we're going to provide you one. We're going to give you hand sanitizer, and please engage in physical distancing or social distancing. Right? For the longest time, there was no discussion if we would be tested at all. Then there was, well, maybe volunteers would be tested, maybe only the ones that work in the athletes' village and would have direct exposure to the athletes. Well, eventually we ended up with 2 PCR tests that were kind of voluntary. But in any case, that's what we ended up with without knowing that beforehand, and we weren't told. Then for a very brief period, all of a sudden, we got the announcement, well, you can get vaccinated by us, and we have this 3-day window. But it was very late in the game, so for those that worked for the Olympics, that was already too late. They wouldn't be fully vaccinated by the time the Olympics rolled around. So the messaging, there was a lot of e-learning then that was relevant or related to the pandemic, but the main messaging remained. And here's Mrs. Hashimoto as the head of the Tokyo Olympic Committee. And she continues saying that, you know, I will shine, we will shine together, and that the Olympics would be safe. And for that, we also have to do something. So even before the pandemic, health care for ourselves was considered very important. And at that point, the largest danger was the heat stroke. So we were supposed to sleep well and have good breakfast and make sure that we get a good exercise so we have healthy bodies, and that we have to also get used to the heat in the months leading up to the Olympics, so that we would not be accustomed to this heat and be able to endure it. The pandemic, then we had the notebook that we were supposed to write in for the 14 days leading up to the pandemic, leading up to our volunteering stint, about our temperatures and how we feel. This is a notebook that most of my colleagues thought that was supposed to be collected, but that was just our health care for ourselves. Then in May, so throughout spring, eventually, you probably heard that there were several editions of playbooks that were rolled out for the athletes, for media people, and as well as for volunteers, of the rules and regulations regarding the pandemic to keep everybody safe. Then in May, finally, people received their uniforms, and that was the prized possession pre-pandemic and really considered the badge of honor. So just this journey takeaway is really, it was an elaborate process. I can tell you a little bit later on the flaws about the foreigner selection. Smiling pre and during pandemic remains the main message. Volunteers are supposed to be the face of the Olympic, and the communication flaws during the pandemic in regards to testing, in regards to spectators. I didn't mention that before. So for the longest part, we didn't know, will there be spectators or not? And that had a significant impact on probably the largest number of volunteers, because just like me, if you were for the Olympics assigned to event services, so EVS team, that meant you were supposed to show the spectators to their seats, stand at the concession stand, stand at the entrances, and have them come in. And with spectators not there anymore, everybody who was in that particular field lost their job. Oops. So now let's come to the field work itself. I worked at the Sea Forest Waterway during the Olympics, so for the rowing and canoeing competitions. So these are just so you have an understanding what this actually looked like, where we worked and what we were doing. This is my team there all the way on the top left. This is the venue. You see empty, empty, empty. We were either supposed to stand here outside leading these people with the right accreditation numbers, so people from the Paralympic and Olympic families to their seats, or we were down here below. We were supposed to pick them up and greet them when they arrived with their Olympic cars, and then guide them to the lounge. I was in the protocol team, and that was my place of work. It was the lounge. So this is the indoor place. We had to make sure people that entered the lounge sanitized their hands. We had to take their temperature. We had to wipe tables once they've eaten something or touched anything. And we had to answer questions, but really that was a big flaw because we weren't trained in answering questions really. We had to remind them to put their mask back on if they so happen to not be perfectly wearing their mask. A big deal and probably the biggest excitement among volunteers was that they got to rub shoulders with the famous ones. So you see here Mr. Andrew Parsons, the head of the International Paralympic Committee. It was very much appreciated by the field cast that he was actually dressed in field cast uniform himself. Mrs. Marukawa, the Olympic minister, and here Mrs. Hashimoto. And there was we were very much kept separate to the athletes, but then there was eventually a little bit of an getting to talk to them, and so that's me talking to the husband and son of one of the gold medalists in German canoeing, German person. And of course, a big element was that you got to make new friends. You see here on the right, that is also the city cast uniform. And the organizing committee did a lot to show their volunteer appreciation. So on your 3rd day and on your 5th day, I believe, and then you would have gotten it on your 10th day, you got little badges here. And badges are altogether a big deal at the Olympics. So different teams were handing out different little pins. At the end of our volunteering, we had this bigger ceremony where we were given this participation certificate and another little pin. And if you have watched the closing ceremony of the Olympics or Paralympics, you would have noticed that the field cast called to the stage and be especially thanked for by the organizers, Mr. Parsons, Mrs. Hashimoto, for having done their job, because we know, and there's no doubt about it, none of these mega events would work if there wouldn't be people willing to work for free for these events. Now, the organizing committee, as was Tokyo, is doing quite now a lot of several steps in order to engage in this legacy building that I mentioned before. So just this Saturday was the thanks event Arigato, in which also again Mrs. Hashimoto did the beginning speech. It was music groups, it was athletes that thanked again in detail the volunteers, told about stories, what their experience was with volunteers, and we are supposed to get a so-called fieldcast Arigato book. And at the end of the thanks event, you could actually, when you registered for the event, you could say, what do I want my name to be shown up at the end of this video? I mean, it was all, of course, I mean, it was a purely YouTube event. And so then everybody who submitted their name, so at the end you had this endless roll of names of field cast members. And the interesting thing is that at some point they said, oh, 20,000 people already registered. Well, I made sure to really check how many people logged into the YouTube video, and the maximum was 7,500 people. All right, of anticipated 110,000 volunteers. Okay. So we were also on our, well, we had this large online platform, and in that we're already told that there's other events we can get engaged in. One of those is the World Masters Games that were delayed also and are now happening in May 2022, with their own mascot, and this is going to be all over Kansai. And you see here again the number of participants that are again supposed to enter Japan. So the next probably biggest sports mega event for Japan. But you also have the World Swimming or Aquatics Championships that are just happening right after end of May in June in Kyushu. So there's, if you have your eye open now, there's one sports mega event after the other rolling out in Japan. And there's a Alumni Network created. So you see here the Tokyo Volunteer Legacy Network, and that is, we still have to wait a little bit on the opening for that. But you see already in the little decoration here and the little images that are on this poster that this is the element where it's not please volunteer again for sports events, but please also volunteer for other elements within Japanese society. So now we're coming back to, and I'm wrapping it up, to my three research questions. So on the hope streams of being an Olympic volunteer, the influences of the pandemic, and what does remain. Now, from my conversations with volunteers, and granted, this is still ongoing, I learned that some wanted to lend a hand in showing how hospitable Japan is. They were hoping to meet lots of different people, to have this event provide them the opportunity to be involved in something. They're still searching for something that they can do, and that is often post-retirement. Some wanted really to have a chance to speak English, to use their ability, and the government, the organization committee had a lot of English training courses provided for free to volunteers. And some mentioned that they really wanted to make new friends or particular international friends, to be part of this once-in-a-lifetime event, to be close to the action, to able to get a glimpse behind the scenes, and some said to be close to athletes that they admire. Well, that's not, that really depended on which team or which position you were assigned to. So some positions didn't provide you that. So now in terms of volunteer satisfaction, and that is, of course, highly influenced by the pandemic, because we know many, we don't know how many, canceled their participation. And that is either full, not participated at all, or partially. We know some even protested Mr. Modi's sexist remarks, the head of the Olympic Committee, and so that was about 1,000. But beyond that, at some point we heard the number 13,000 declined to work as field cast, but we really don't know. Some told me that they partially declined, so that they were assigned for the Olympics and Paralympics, but because they weren't vaccinated yet during the Olympics, they wanted to wait until they're fully vaccinated, and so then only participated during the Paralympics. So at this Fieldcast Arigato event, they told us how many people applied, and they gave us, again, all the statistics, men, women, ages, and so on, but they didn't tell us the final numbers. And I think there's a reason why. So I think the number is significantly smaller than we think. No volunteers were able to enter the country from abroad. Only the few, apparently there was an exception made for those working with horses, or the equestrian volunteers, because that is special skills that not enough people within Japan had. All the while, you're the ones that continued working. Of course, there was that fear of the virus continuing to be in the back of your mind. People were telling me, of course, you had to wear your masks. Smiling is harder. You have to smile with your eyes. It's harder, of course, particularly in the heat. There was no spectacle or festival mood. The empty, endless seats of rows of empty seats there were actually rather depressing, and it was very quiet for most of the days there. The uniform turned from this badge of honor to something that some felt the need to hide. So we were told originally told you have to come in your uniform to the venue. There's no changing places. There's no way to put your stuff anywhere. But some still did because they didn't want to be seen in their neighborhood, at least, with their uniforms. The mood, they're saying, the mood in the public changed so much, so they didn't want to rub it in people's eyes or faces that they were continuing sort of to support the Olympics. Yet, on the other hand, pretty much everybody had to restrain themselves for over a year, right? So constantly being told, stay at home, work from home, don't go out to restaurants. And all of a sudden, after this 1 year, more than you're used to staying by yourself, and all of a sudden, you meet hundreds of new people, see thousands of people. This being in the midst of this international global event, despite it all, despite no spectators, this really buzz at the venues, the excitement of the Olympic family members cheering when competition was happening. So that was such a drastic change. So that, of course, led to excitement among volunteers. And it's really these days that you were spending there and you really just fell to bed after you come home because it was physically so strenuous. And that is really an extraordinary period compared to your normal life, whatever you do. But then on the other hand, and this was particularly true for all these first-time volunteers, there are some experienced volunteers that had one of my field cast members. He already participated in the 2002 Soccer World Cup and participated in the Rugby World Cup in 2019. So really an experienced volunteer. And for him, this was less of everything, right? Because it was less of a spectacle than he was used to. So last but not least, the volunteer legacy. So I think the efforts on the side of the Tokyo Olympic Committee as well as the Tokyo government were, I mean, picture book, the way you're supposed to do this, to honor the volunteers by badges or these pins, by giving certificates, by thanking us over and over and over again, by being willing to pose for any picture that volunteers wanted to take. I mean, really, it was repeated over and over. And the efforts to retain volunteers are are really the way you're supposed to do this, creating this alumni network and informing us on other social sports mega events that are happening and possibilities for volunteers to continue with another episode of exciting volunteering. And on the other hand, the volunteers are a very heterogeneous group. And any kind of research that I've read, that's the case for any sports mega event volunteering, and the motivations differ. And because the motivations differ, the outcome also differs. And that is what I experienced here at Tokyo 2020, absolutely concurrent with what the academic literature tells me about other events. And so overall, we know retaining volunteers is a very difficult situation. Tokyo always mentioned the London Olympics as the ideal for, that's how we want to have it. We want to have this successful alumni network as London has it. But then other research I read said, well, it's actually not as successful. We know the pandemic played a huge role in this. We have less volunteers and we couldn't, for example, go out partying with each other and really confirming these newly made friendships right away, because mokushoku, we were not supposed to talk during our lunch break, and we were having to restrain ourselves. So after our work shift, we were not supposed to go out with these with our new friends to go out and drink and meet each other better. So, and the outside sentiment outside the venues really changed on Tokyo 2020. So it was a reduced spectacle, but certainly a huge change from this 1 year of self-restraint. There were new friendships definitely being made. My group, for example, of about 25 people have now a line group, and they post different things and about other things that they do now in life, or what they're going to be doing in the future in regards to volunteering and so on. So it's hard to say. I think any kind of legacy evaluation takes anyway years. I think the government has it very hard to retain the volunteers and the volunteers numbers that they had. So I think this large scale shift in volunteer culture was not achieved through Tokyo 2020. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.